Hey guys, today we're going to talk about two sections of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. We're going to talk about sensory qualities as real and consciousness as possessing identity. Stay tuned. So today we're going to talk about two sections of OPAR together, and that is because they're so closely related that really they're making one basic point, that consciousness has identity, and that identity is what enables us to achieve knowledge. It's not what prevents us from achieving knowledge. So let's dive right in with an overview of what Leonard Peikoff covers in these sections. So in sensory qualities as real, we start off by being reminded that there's a distinction Ayn Rand recognizes between the form of awareness and the object of awareness. We're aware of objects in a certain form. And the question is, okay, well, can we distinguish those two? And Leonard says, yes, we can distinguish those two, but we distinguish them scientifically, and philosophically it's not important at all. What is important is to recognize, to be able to answer the question of, well, what is the status of our forms of awareness? That are they just invented by the mind? Are they subjective? And the answer is that no, they're not, that they're forms of awareness, and that they're not in the object itself. They're not created by the mind. They're a product of a certain relationship between the object and the subject. They're a product of a relationship between reality and our means of grasping reality. And so we can't ask, where is sweetness located? Where is red located? Any more that you can ask, between Don and Kate, where is their marriage located? It is a relationship. But he adds, and from a deeper perspective, that the forms of awareness are in the object. They're in reality. That is, they're not at all invented by the mind. Even our form of awareness is the product of certain metaphysically given facts about the objects out in reality and about our sense organs. That at no stage is the mind coming in and just waving a wand and arbitrarily deciding to invent forms of awareness. Now, finally, Leonard makes the point that the contrasting idea, the idea that's really going against this, the objectivist view that awareness is a product of a relationship between reality and the mind, that awareness is awareness in a certain form, is the mirror view of consciousness, or what's sometimes in philosophy called the diaphanous view of consciousness, that consciousness should contribute nothing and should just be a passive reflection of how reality really looks, of how reality really appears. And that's what's going to start us off when we move to the next section, consciousness as possessing identity. So Objectivism rejects the mere theory of consciousness. It rejects the idea that consciousness should be or is a passive mirror, and says that this view that that's what consciousness should be, that it should be passive. This is exactly what's cashed in on by people like Kant, who say that, well, look, consciousness should just be a passive mirror. It clearly isn't, and therefore we don't have awareness. Our means of awareness, from the perceptual level to the conceptual level to the level of introspection, is all shaped by the identity of our consciousness, and so we can never know reality as it really is. And Ayn Rand's answer is there is no such thing as reality as it really isn't. That what Kant is doing is saying, and she has an eloquent quote that I'm sorry if I butcher, is that man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind, and the things he perceives do not exist because he perceives them. And Objectivism sweeps all that aside and says that consciousness has identity, and that's not a barrier to cognition. It's not a barrier to awareness. It is the means of awareness. It is the precondition of awareness, that precisely because to be aware is to undergo a process of awareness, that process has identity, and you can't escape that. You can't get around it, nor should you have any inclination to. That is exactly how we know. So I want to start with why I'm putting these two topics together, And it basically is because I think what consciousness, the most important idea in the sense perception section, is precisely that consciousness has identity. But to get that, you need to actually have some of the content. So what we have gotten in this section so far is that the senses are valid. They give us awareness, and they give us awareness through a certain relationship between the objects of awareness and the subject, our means of perception. And what consciousness has identity is saying is it's putting those together and saying that consciousness has identity. It undergoes a process that allows us to perceive reality in a particular form, and that is not a barrier to awareness. It is the precondition of awareness. And so if you had tried, and Leonard has talked about even in early drafts of OPAR actually doing this, you could have, or think that you could have, consciousness has identity is just a straightforward application of the law of identity to consciousness. So you could just plunk that, early on in metaphysics. But then that idea of consciousness has identity would have no content, and it would just be kind of rationalistic deduction. And what we want to see, and the reason why I wanted to do these together, is so that we could keep very firmly in mind some of the core facts about consciousness that are being integrated when we look at consciousness from the perspective of, yes, it has identity. And in particular, what we're recognizing is that it has a process involved in achieving awareness. And now we know something about that process. It's a process of a causal interaction between the objects in our senses that give us awareness in a certain form, and that form is not what we're aware of, it's how we're aware. It's not what we perceive, it's how we perceive, and that it's not a distortion. It is precisely what enables us to have direct awareness of reality. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about consciousness, the identity of consciousness, and viewing it from the perspective of it's what enables awareness. So I want to say a few words about this idea that consciousness should be a mirror, that it should be passive. So this is kind of the starting point. The idea is that in order for us to have knowledge of reality, our consciousness can't contribute anything. It can't have any identity. And basically what naive realism, which we talked about last time, said was, well, hey, good luck for us. It doesn't actually have an identity. And what the representationalists came along and said is, well, clearly it does have an identity, and therefore we can't be aware, or at least we're not directly aware of reality. We have to have some means of establishing that what the kind of internal images we're perceiving on the screen in our mind resemble reality. So I think it's important to get what makes the mirror theory plausible. And one analogy that might be helpful is, like, imagine the police are investigating a crime and a bystander snaps a picture. Well, the question is, does that picture really resemble the suspect? If they have some like Instagram or Snapchat filter on, and it becomes a problem, right? Like, have you distorted what the suspect really looks like? Like, maybe you're making somebody who's, dark skin look light skinned, or vice versa. Maybe there's a giant dog face and you want to know, like, no, does this resemble the object? And in philosophy, what you're getting is the naive realist saying, yeah, there is no filter. This is a picture of reality as it really is. And then you get the representationalists who say, that's ridiculous. The whole relativity of the senses arguments we talked about in previous episodes are precisely showing that no, our senses are contributing something. There's a filter there, if you want to put it that way. So for example, if I see a circular object, well, from certain angles, if I move around, now that circle looks more like an oval. Or, the example we had of like two hands at different temperatures going into the same water, and one hand feeling cold and one hand feeling warm. Or the fact that, some people see color, some people are color blind. There's these array of ways, and even, to take the most sophisticated example, once you reach a certain stage of scientific development, we know that that color as we perceive it, like, that's not what object, like that there's much that's contributed by our sensory apparatus. And so it's completely crazy to say that our senses contribute nothing, that we contribute nothing, that awareness is just a passive mirror. It's not. And so you can see then why there's this real problem. If awareness is supposed to be a passive mirror, which makes sense, we want the photo to resemble reality, and then we have a real problem because we have indisputable knowledge that, from regular experience to science, that says, no, there's a contribution from consciousness, and so the question is, well, what do we make of that? Now, what's Objectivism's view? Objectivism rejects the whole view of consciousness as a mirror, or awareness as requiring consciousness to be a mirror. That Objectivism insists that any process of awareness is a process, and any process of awareness is a process of awareness. So the awareness consciousness has to have an identity. That's the precondition of knowledge. Any consciousness has to operate by a certain means. But what we perceive isn't the means. We don't perceive objects as they appear to our mind. We perceive objects through their appearance to us. What we perceive is not our form of awareness. We perceive objects in a certain form. What we perceive is not the effects of things in reality on us. What we perceive is reality through its effects. And that's really the core idea that's being underlined and developed in this section. So let's go back to the picture analogy. It's not that we have pictures of reality floating in our mind, and then the question is, does it look like reality? Does it look like reality really is? That there's no such thing as perceiving reality as it really isn't. That our awareness isn't pictures. It's direct awareness of reality. And this is easy to see, I think, if we think about a different sense modality. So if you take sweetness, does an apple really taste sweet? Is that the right way to taste it? Is that how it tastes in reality apart from our senses? No, taste is a certain relationship between the object and our means of awareness. And what can differ through different senses and different sense modalities is only the form, not the object. That the sweetness is us perceiving certain facts through our senses. And if we had different senses, well, we'd perceive those same facts in a different form. So it's not that there's some sight that's not distorted and some sight that is distorted, and we have to figure out which is which, and hopefully we have the non-distorted sight. There is only sight. There's only awareness, and distortion. Distortion is a legitimate concept, but it's not to distinguish perceiving reality as it really is versus perceiving it and in some way that is not giving us access to the objects. Distortion is when we're perceiving reality in an unusual way. So, take something like you take eye drops and they make your vision blurry. Your vision is distorted, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that you're perceiving unreality. It doesn't mean that your mind is creating some sort of fantasy realm. What's going on is that you're perceiving the object in an unusual way. And now in this particular case, it's a way where you're getting less information. You can discriminate less information about reality, but it's still you're perceiving the objects in a certain form. And part of what you're perceiving is a certain fact. The fact that there's this goo in your eye, and it might be causing your eye to artificially dilate and take in too much light or something. At no point is it that your mind's inventing a different reality. It's just giving you access to a causal sequence that allows you to know reality. And they've even done experiments where they play with people's perception and change it in various ways. And what you have is that in most cases that people are they adjust to these changes in perception, and that insofar as there's even enough information to discriminate certain things, they can actually function. And then the deeper point, and this goes back to points that Leonard made at the very beginning of this section, none of this matters once we get to the conceptual level. Once we get to the conceptual level, we can distinguish form and object. And just as a color-blinded person, put it this way: if what we perceived was the form, i.e., we didn't have access to the object, we had this form that kept us, that was like a blanket between us and reality, then if our forms of perception were different, we would reach different conclusions in the conceptual level. But as Leonard points out, a colorblind man and a normal sighted man, they don't reach different physics, precisely because what we perceive is reality in a form, not the form itself. And so once we get to the conceptual level, none of the different forms of perception interfere with our ability to reach conclusions about reality and reach even the same conclusions about reality. So from Objectivism's perspective, we can think of it this way. The whole endeavor of epistemology is necessary because in pursuing knowledge, we're always trying to answer two questions. What do I know, and how do I know it? And Ayn Rand sees the history of philosophy is really littered with people rejecting one of those two questions. We have the skeptics who say, what do we know? Nothing. Or the mystics who say, yeah, we know something, but we know it effortlessly, automatically, know how. There's no question of how do we know it. Or to tie it to the mere conception, you have this assumption that knowledge needs to be, that consciousness needs to be this mirror that gives us effortless knowledge of reality, and skeptics say, no, it isn't, and mystics say, yes, it is. Both sides agree that process knowledge isn't knowledge of reality, but of the processing. And Ayn Rand's answer to the mystics and the skeptics is that all knowledge is process knowledge, but it's process knowledge. It is process awareness of reality. And that's what we're striving for, and that's what we're going to need epistemology for, is to tell us that given the way our consciousness works, what is going to be the volitional process that we have to follow and to adhere to reality. Whereas in this section of OPAR, what we're seeing is what is the automatic process that gives us direct awareness of reality. And what we're really trying to do is sweep aside the skeptics who say that there is that the very existence of a process, even an automatic process at the level of the senses, disqualifies knowledge. And Ayn Rand sweeping that aside with this idea of upholding and celebrating, you could say, that consciousness has identity. So in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Ayn Rand actually gives a really interesting example where she says, this kind of mirror theory of consciousness and perspective basically says that it's the equivalent of saying in the realm of nutrition that we shouldn't have to undergo a process of digestion in order to gain nutrition. It should just kind of like soak into us effortlessly, automatically, through no particular means. And that since it doesn't, nutrition is just a matter of social convention, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to eat poisonous mushrooms. So the final thing I want to say is that we haven't exhausted the identity of consciousness. We've gotten some of the foundational content of what the identity of consciousness is. But, as we go through the book, we're going to learn more about the identity of consciousness, such as that it's volitional, that it's conceptual, that to keep conceptual knowledge tied to perception, it needs a certain method, logic, that consciousness is a faculty of a biological organism and it has its own needs, and that one of those needs is art. So this is going to run throughout the book of learning more and more about the identity of consciousness. But at every level, the identity of consciousness is the precondition of awareness. It's the precondition of cognition. It's not a disqualifier. So that's it for this section. Next time, or these two sections, next time we have one more section on sense experience where we're going to go into the perceptual level as the metaphysically given way in which we're directly aware of existence versus primarily the level of sensation, something we've indicated before, but there's a lot more to say about, and then we'll move on to volition. That's it for this time. Please be sure to like this video, and I'd really love it if you're enjoying this series to share it with others and help us actually get this content out there for people who want to go through and really up their level of understanding about objectivism. I will talk to you next time. See you then.